Hi class, in this video we're going to set up our lab environment for this class. So I've signed into www.ssitlab.com. You're going to go to the drop-down menu and copy the lab to your lab. From this point on, you don't need to copy it again. You just need to sign in and go here to connect to the lab. Because I just copied it, I want to activate the lab so I can do things to it. Now I'm going to turn all the virtual machines on. It's going to take a minute to boot. So I'm going to pause the video while it's booting. Okay, all my machines have booted. So now I'm going to just look at them. There's RHS1, Red Hat Server 1, Red Hat Server 2, my DC, and my member server. All the commands that I'm going to run, I've listed in the lab. So these are my commands I want to run on the DC, my member server, RHS1, Red Hat Server 1, and Red Hat Server 2. Red Hat Server 1 and 2 are going to be joined to the domain just like the member server. So what I'm doing is I have two screens. So you might want to pull up the instructions on your tablet or something and then do the lab on your computer. So I'm going to go to the DC. I'm going to sign in. First thing I'm going to do is configure my IP settings, then rename my computer and reboot. Now I'm going to do this on ASIT. If you do this on your home computer, your IP scheme might be different than what you're seeing here. So you use an IP scheme that's appropriate for your computer, for your virtual setup. I'm just using PowerShell ISE just so I can zoom in and out so you can see the commands. New net IP. Now the default gateway is part of the network, but you can't see it. The router for this network is part of ASIT. It is there, you just can't see it. Again, if this command runs scrolls off the screen, don't worry about it because you have the notes over on D2L. So I'm going to put my two upstream servers. That's a comma, not a period. And when I promote this to a domain controller, those will become forwarders. Computer names and domain names should always be lowercase, especially in this environment because we're going to integrate some Linux servers in our network. So it's going to reboot, and I'm going to pause the video while it reboots. It's rebooted, so I'm going to sign in. Now I'm going to install the Active Directory software, then promote it to a new forest. I'm actually going to pin this to the taskbar. I did that intentionally so you could see the command. That wasn't a typo. Okay, so now I'm going to encrypt my password and then promote it to a new forest. So this is going to take a little bit, so I'm going to pause the video. Okay, my DC is promoted, so now I'm going to create my reverse zone and create a pointer record for the DC. So I have a reverse and a record for my DC. There's my IP address. Um, I'm not using the default subnet mask. I'm using /24. Let me show you from here so you can see. I'm using the IPv6 and IPv4 loopback. My two upstreams are the Google machines. So I'm going to make sure I can ping the internet. Sometimes we get um, stuff messed up on ACE where it can't ping. So I'm going to go back to lab. I'm going to reset my router. There's a reset router button. Okay, I'm going to pause while try to figure out why I can't ping the internet. Okay, class, I figured out what the issue was. I never connected it to the public interface for these two machines. So I'm going to sign back into the DC. So now I can ping IPs on the internet, and I can resolve names on the internet. Don't worry about this red because it's just saying it's a non-authorized answer, and I'm in PowerShell ISE. Incidentally, guys, if I type hostname on the regular PowerShell and then exit and go back in, I could hit the up arrow. So the regular PowerShell has history where the ISE does not. So if I hit the up arrow right here, I can only go back to the commands that I've entered in this session. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, the last thing we need to do on the DC is we need to open up WinRM so we can remotely control this machine from our Ansible server. So what I'm going to do is just run a PowerShell script created by people in the Ansible group. Again, this URL is in the documentation on D2L. I'm going to pause the video. I'm getting a message on Skype. Okay, sorry. I am still doing advising hours. So when I get a call, I generally have to take it. So guys, I'm going to zoom out here. So basically, the script resides out in the internet. So I'm giving on GitHub. So I'm giving the path to where the script is, and this invoke rest method means go grab the script, then pipe it over into invoke expressions. So it's actually going to grab the script off the internet, then execute it. So I'm just going to verify I have no typos before I do. Again, this URL is on D2L. So I do have a typo. The Ansible directory is listed twice. Okay, so that just opened up remote management on this Windows server. So my DC is up and running now. So I'm going to type exit to exit out of this, and I'm going to move on to my member server. So again, I'm going to do my IP address and host name and join it to the domain. Guys, I'm using tab complete to type in these names. I'm typing IN tab. That's the wrong one. Tab again. Guys, typos will kill you. So this is going to join it to the domain and rename it at the same time. Then once I get back in, I need to open up remote management so the Ansible server can uh, control this machine. So because I joined to the domain, I'm going to sign in as a domain admin. So I'm going to run the same exact script as I did last time. Okay. It also created a certificate at the same time, opened up remote management. So this machine is ready to go and it's part of the domain. So now I'm going to go over to S1, the first Red Hat server. I'm going to drag up, sign in. We're using our standard password, capital PA11WORD. I'm going to open up a terminal. I need to sign in as root. So type SU space hyphen, then our standard password. Okay, and this first command is nmcli. It is Network Manager command line interface. So basically, I'm going to be configuring an IP address. So I can type IP adder or IP address is the real command, and the NIC that I want to configure is ENS5. Normally it would be ETH0 or ETH1, but what we're going to be dealing with is NICs on this virtual environment, so it's called ENS5. Normally I would just type IP adder, but the full command is actually IP address. I could do IP route, things like that. So right now I'm going to use clear an nmcli. I'm going to do a connection, and instead of typing out connection, I'm just going to type con. Uh, the connection name is ENS5. The IP4 address is 10.0.0.0.4 because we use 3 on the member server, and our gateway for an IPv4 network is 10.0.0.1. The interface name, because this is going to be like a profile name. So the interface I want to associate this is ENS5. That's my physical interface. The type is an Ethernet connection. And it's the IPv4 DNS is 10.0.0.2. That's my DC. IPv4 method is going to be manual, meaning I don't want a dynamic IP. I want a static IP. Depending on the order in which you put these commands, you can set a static IP but still have it set to DHCP. So I'm just trying to avoid any issues by saying it's definitely manual. I could put the DNS information before the IP information, and at that point it'll still be considered DHCP. So to avoid that, I'm just specifying that it is definitely a static IP and not a DHCP IP. And when I boot up this machine, I want this connection to automatically come up. And I can do nmcli connection show, and I can see that interface is right there. So I'm going to do IP adder, and I can see I'm actually using that IP right now. If I do IP route, I can see there's my default gateway. Okay, the next thing I want to do is configure my host name. Host name control set host name is rhs1.contoso.com. And I want to be able to handle that host. I want to be able to resolve that host name locally to my loopback address. So if my network is down, I can still resolve rhs1.contoso.com to my loopback address. So I'm going to echo uh, um, extended expressions, meaning I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm telling Echo with this -E to interpret this as an escape T, which is a tab character. So what I'm doing is displaying this file. I took this content and inserted it at the end of this file. So I'm going to show you the file. So now I have this right here. And do you see that right here ended up being a tab? Okay, so now I'm going to go back up and change this to ::1. That's the IPv6 loopback. And I'm going to put a second tab in there just to line everything. So if I cap my host file again, I can see I'm resolving my long name and my short name to the IPv4 loopback, and my long name and short name, my fully qualified domain name, and my host name to the IPv6 loopback. Now I'm going to reboot the machine. I'm going to sign back in. And I'm going to SU as root again. So I'm signing in as root. SU stands for switch user. Okay, now we're going to install some software, create a user account, create some um, keys, and then join it to the domain. Now, I need to install the Ansible software. And basically, we're using Red Hat. So to install that additional software, I need to have a paid subscription, which we don't have. So instead of using Red Hat's repository of software, I'm going to add another repository of software by using the Fedora group. Fedora is like the test bed for Red Hat. So we're just going to use another repository of software. So Yum, which stands for Yellow Dog Unmodified, it's a utility that will retrieve software packages from a repository off the internet and install it. Pass it to another piece of software called RPM to install it. So Yum will retrieve it, pass it off to RPM to install it. So I'm going to install this other repository. I can use Yum to install software, or I can use Yum to install another repository. A repository is a server on the internet that holds a bunch of software that I can install that's pre-compiled for this machine with this type of kernel that I'm using. So I'm going to do HTTPS. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure I'm using the right character. Download. I wanted to make sure that was an L, not a 1, and it is an L. This is extra packages for enterprise Linux. That's the repository that we're installing. Fedora the Linux version to Fedora has a lot more eye candy and the most bleeding edge software. Uh, so some of that stuff never gets made to the server product. So by doing this, we're going to get all that software that never makes it to the server product, and it's probably going to be a later version than what you would get, but it might be a little more unstable. But for this lab, it's going to be fine. In a real production environment, I would get a subscription from Red Hat. When things go south, you have someone to call to help you. It's saying I don't have a subscription, which is fine. So now that I have that repository installed, I can do a yum-y. I'm going to install Ansible, Kerberos, and Python 3.6. I forgot the word install. Okay, so it installed all that software. Sometimes there's software that users generally install together. And Red Hat has grouped those softwares into group installs. So I'm going to use yum-y. And guys, really, I'm using something, yum is outdated. I'm really using something called DNF. But if you run DNF, if you run yum, you're actually running DNF. So if you see commands out there saying DNF, that's the same software as yum. Back in the day, yum used to be the software that we were using. They switched to DNF. But a lot of people kept going back to yum. So really, when you run yum now, you're actually running DNF. So just be aware of that. Yum is really DNF. So I'm going to do a group install. That Y right there means don't prompt me to hit yes. Just do it automatically. Sorry. Group install. Guys, everything in Linux is case sensitive. So just get used to that. So when I install development tools, it's going to install a bunch of programming tools. Okay, now I'm going to install a Python module called pywinrm. WinRM will allow us to write Python modules that we can connect to a Windows box and remotely control a Windows box. So I'm going to use Python 3. I don't want to use Python 2, so I'm specifying Python 3. Python install. This is a module that will allow me to install other modules. Install Python Win, and we're going to use Kerberos to authenticate to that Windows network. Okay, so we've installed that module. Now I'm going to add a user and add that user to the wheel group. Wheel group, if you're a member of that group, that will allow you to run administrative commands. So we're going to create a user called Devops. And we're going to set the password for that user. I'm going to use our standard password, PA11WORD. I could have just ran this command and typed the password twice. And if I use it this way, you won't see the password on my screen. But because I'm doing a video, I'm doing it this method so you can actually see the password that I'm typing. Now I'm going to edit this file called sudoers. And I'm going to open up the wheel group to allow it to run administrative commands without typing a password. So I'm using a command called Sssd, stream editor. So it'll allow me to just open up a file, make changes to it, and close it without actually opening an editor. So basically, I have a directory called Etsy. Inside of there, there's a file called sudoers. It's going to allow it's a file that says who can run super user command, sudo. That's what it means, super user do. So who is a sudoer? So basically, I'm going to replace this with nothing. So I'm going to replace this with this. So basically, I'm uncommenting out that line. It means substitute globally any occurrence of this with this. Cat, Etsy, sudoer, and I'm going to grep for wheel. So you can see those lines. So now these lines aren't commented out. So anyone who's a member of the wheel group can run privileged commands with no password. It's not going to prompt you for a password every time you run a command. Now I'm going to install some additional software that I need to join this box to the Windows domain. Now, when you run these commands, you can't be close. You have to have the commands exact. So typos are going to kill you. So this is all the software I need to join this Linux box to a Windows domain. Okay, I'm using a command called dig contoso.com. So I can resolve contoso.com. I can use host contoso.com. I can use nslookup contoso.com. I think there's one other command I can't remember off the top of my head. But all these commands just test name resolution. So before I can join to the domain, I need to be able to resolve domain names. So that's what I just tested. So now I'm going to search for the domain. I want to see if I can find the domain. And I can. So now I'm going to join it to the domain. And the user account I'm going to use is the administrator account. Prompting me for the password. Capital PA11WORD. Okay, now if I do discover, here is it configured? No. Here, I'm a member of the domain. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to do two things. When I sign in as a domain user account, I want to make sure that I can automatically create my home directory on this Linux box. When you sign in to a user account on a Linux box, you need to sign in and be placed in your home directory. That's the directory you're going to be starting in. So when I create a new account on this Linux machine, it'll automatically create my home directory. But these accounts aren't created locally, they're created on the domain if I'm using a domain account. So I won't have a home directory. So one thing I want to do is automatically create that home directory when they sign in. Also, I want to tell my system that you have two sets of databases you can use to sign in. It's called PAM, Password Authorization Modules. So instead of configuring PAM manually, we have some new utilities called auth-select, and will allow me to either choose to sign in against my local database of user accounts or the domain database of user accounts. So I'm going to do auth-select. So those are the files that it created. I'm going to modified rather. I'm going to do auth-select. Okay, guys, I don't know if I needed to run this command and this command. I think I could have gotten away with just this command, but I'm not going to test it. So if I'm wrong in that regards, please forgive me. So now I need to edit this configuration file for Sssd. So I have a directory called Etsy, another directory underneath it called Sssd. Then inside of that directory, I have a file called sssd.conf. This is the configuration file for Sssd. So VI is a text editor. So I'm just going to edit this text file that's in the SSSD directory that's in the Etsy directory. So I'm going to go to the very bottom. I'm going to type, I'm right now in command mode. I'm not in input mode. So I'm going to go to the very bottom and hit a lowercase o. That takes me out of command mode and it puts me in insert mode. So I'm going to type these three lines. Kerberos 5 lifetime equals 1 hour. That means I'm going to get a certificate. Every time I need a Kerberos certificate or a Kerberos ticket, I'll keep it for 1 hour. And then I'm going to make it renewable. Automatically get that new certificate. In 30 seconds. Now I'm going to press the escape key. That takes me out of insert mode and back into command mode. Basically, I added these two lines so we don't have to keep requesting our Kerberos ticket manually. I'll show you what I'm talking about in a minute. So I'm going to press escape and WQ to quit. Excuse me. I'm going to press escape, :WQ. That will save, that will write and quit VI. So I'm going to restart Sssd. System control, restart Sssd. Because we made changes to the configuration file. So when I make changes to a configuration file, I need to restart the service so it knows about the changes. So I'm going to allow everyone in my domain to sign into this Linux box. You might want to restrict it to a certain group. I'm just going to do it for everyone. So I'm going to do kinit administrator. Guys, I have to put this in uppercase when I request a ticket. So basically, all I did was grab a Kerberos ticket. So if I do klist, so I just manually tested to make sure that I can get a Kerberos ticket. I can do su now space administrator at contoso.com. And I was able to actually log in. It didn't prompt me for a password because I'm signed in as root. But if I were not signed in as root, I would be able to log in and it would prompt me for my password. But if you're signed in as root and you SU to another user account, it doesn't prompt you. So right now I can see I'm signed in with the domain user account. I can see that I'm in my own home directory. It created it automatically. So I'm going to exit out of that user account because I was nested authentication. So I'm back signed in as root. I'm going to reboot this machine. So while that's rebooting, actually I'm going to wait. I'm going to test logging in as administrator graphically so you can see that works as well. So the user account I want to sign into is not listed. So I'm just going to click not listed. I'm going to type administrator at contoso.com. Type in my password. So this machine is now joined to the domain. This is the first time I'm logging in with this user account, so it walks me through this. Beginning wizard. So I'm going to log out. Now it's listed. So I'm going to go into Devops. That was a user account we created earlier. Again, it's the first time I'm signing in as Devops. So I have to go through this getting started wizard. Just to show you that I can run administrative commands as DevOps without a password, I'll do sudo cat etc shadow. This is a file only the root user account can view. So I was able to view it no problem because when I do a sudo command, it signs me in as root, does the command, and signs me back out. Okay, so now let's join RHS2 to the domain. So the first thing we need to do is, again, set up our IP addresses and host name. We're going to use our standard password. I'm going to sign in as root. When I run sudo, it signs me in as root, does a command, and signs me back out. But when I sign in with SU, that doesn't mean super user. That means switch user. And I could have done this. But I could switch user to any user account that I wanted. But if I don't supply a root user account, it automatically assumes root. And if I do pwd, I'm in root's home directory. Now, if I just did SU with no hyphen and signed in, look what home directory I'm in. I'm in the wrong home directory. So when I use this hyphen, not only do I sign in with that user account, I use that new user account's profile. But if I leave the hyphen off, I'm still using student's profile, and that's not what I want to do. When I sign in as root, I want to use root's profile. So what I'm going to do is do su space hyphen. And that will make sure that I sign in as root and I use root's profile. So I'm going to do IP adder. The NIC I want to configure in this case, because we're in this virtual environment, is ENS8. So network manager command line interface connection add. Now listen, I can use nmcli to configure devices or a connection. Think of a connection as like a wireless profile. You know how you can have your phone have multiple wireless profiles? Well, you still only have one Wi-Fi radio, but you have a bunch of profiles that can use that Wi-Fi radio. So that's what we're doing. We're going to create a profile, and the profile name is I'm going to match it to the physical interface. In this case, my physical interface is ENS8. The IPv4 address, the IP4 address is 0.0.5. The IPv4 gateway is 1. The physical device name that we're trying to link this connection to is ENS8. Some people don't like to have the connection name match the device name. It confuses people. That's what I do. It is an Ethernet device. The IPv4 DNS servers that I want to use is my DC. I'm going to tell it to use a static IP and not the DHCP IP. And I want to say when you boot this machine up, automatically turn this connection on. Use this profile. If I do IP adder, I can see I'm now using that IP. If I do nmcli connection show, I can see that the fact that it's green means it's connected and being used. I might sometimes have to do this connection down ENS5. I'm telling it to deal with a connection, not a device. And that will bring the connection down, and now it's white. Or I can do connection up. And I can see it's green again. If I bring it down and I do IP adder, I don't have an IP address. If I bring it up, I have an IP address that I assigned statically. Okay, so now I want to set my host name. So this is going to set my long and short name. My fully qualified domain name, my long name will be rhs2.contoso.com, and my short name or my host name will be rhs2 alone. Guys, I don't have to go to the end of the line to press enter. I can press enter anywhere I want. And it works except the whole command. So in case my network is down, I still need to resolve my own host name. So I'm going to put an entry in etc host resolving my long and short name to my loopback addresses, IPv4 and IPv6. I'm going to hit the up arrow, change this to my IPv6 loopback, and add a second tab, just because of anal. So there's those bottom two lines. And after you rename your computer, it's always wise to reboot. Sign back in. Now on the first machine, the first Linux box, I installed Ansible. On this machine, I'm not going to be an Ansible control host. I'm just going to be an Ansible client. So I don't actually need, and that's actually a bad term. Um, this is going to be Ansible managed host because Ansible doesn't really have a client. So I don't really need to install the Ansible managed host software. I just need to install Python, um, and I also need to install the stuff to join it to the domain. So I'm going to sign in as root again. Certain things only root can do. There's no other administrator account really other than root. When you configure sudo, you're just allowing that user to run commands as root. So to do a lot of administrative tasks, you need to be signed in as root. So I'm going to install um, the Epl repository so I can install additional software that I normally would have to have a subscription to install. Again, this is probably not the most stable software. So if you're in a production environment, I wouldn't do this. I would stick to the Red Hat official software. This software is bleeding edge stuff, which means you have the latest bugs. Where if you get the software off of Red Hat's repository, Red Hat has went through that code with a fine-tooth comb and fixed any bugs that there are or that have been discovered so far. So now I'm going to install the Python module. Python 3.6. It can work with earlier versions of Python, but I haven't played with it, so I'm just sticking to 3.6. So if you're in an older Red Hat 7 box or something and you were going to use a different Python, you might have to make some changes. I'm going to pause it while it's installing this. So now I'm going to create a Devops user account. Now, there's a piece of software called Kickstart. Just why I'm talking. I'm going to add this user to the wheel group so they can run sudo commands. There's a piece of software called Kickstart. It allows you to deploy Linux boxes. It's like it creates an answer file. So when I deploy this in a production environment, I might want to use my answer file to create this user account for me. I could actually do all this stuff with an answer file that I've done so far. Um, but since these boxes are already deployed, meaning it's already installed, we have to do it manually. So I'm going to set the password for that user account, capital PA11WORD. I'm going to pipe that over to the password command and tell the password command to get it from a redirect, meaning standard in. I'm going to echo that password, and that password is going to become the input for the second command. So I just set my password for the Devops user account. Now I'm going to permit any user in the wheel group to run sudo commands without typing a password. So I'm going to modify my sudoers file and say, and remove the comment in front of %will. This is a group name. It's commented out inside that file. Let me show you that. So cat etc sudoers. You see this command right here? This is the command I ran. Cat displays the contents of a file. So it's commented out. So what I'm going to do is use sed, edit it in place, meaning just don't display the changes on my screen, but actually edit the file. Replace any occurrence of hash mark, %will with just %will globally. So substitute this for this anywhere in the file. And the name of the file is etc sudoers. Now if I cat sudoers, I can see that this line is no longer commented out. Any line starting with the hash mark is a comment. So I just commented this out. This line allows people in their group wheel to run all commands. This does the same thing, but without a password. And in a production environment, I probably wouldn't do this, but it's certainly going to make things easier in the class. In real life, I'd probably want to be prompted for a password every time. And the reason being is if you walk away from your keyboard with your screen still on, then someone can run a command that you might not want them to run. So now I'm going to install the software I need to join this box to the domain. This joining to the domain part is really not part of this class, but this class is really designed only to control Linux boxes. But the software can also control Windows boxes as well. So I'm going to do this and give you some tips on how to control some Windows boxes as well. So anyone who wants to explore and play around with Ansible in a Windows environment too, you'll have that ability. But if you look through the curriculum, they don't have us do this portion of the lab. But I'm doing it so There will be 4 or 5 of you that want to explore further than what the class is supposed to cover. So it's not bad that you get a little extra knowledge. Hold on one moment, please. Guys, I didn't press return there. It just wrapped to the second line. So I'm installing the software to join this box to a Windows domain. I'm going to verify I can resolve contoso.com to an IP. It should be the IP of my DC. So I'm going to now try to discover the domain. And I can discover the domain no problem. Now I'm going to join the domain with my administrator account. I'm going to go back up to Discover using my history, and I can see I'm now part of the domain. I can do realm list to get the same information. I explained this in the last. I'm not sure why I'm getting this error. Let me try this. I'm going to try to restart Sssd. I'm going to try to reboot this box before I continue. I'm just going to sign into Devops. It really doesn't matter. First time I signed in as Devops. So now I'm going to open up a command prompt and sign in as root. For security reasons, you don't want to log in graphically as root. You don't want to do everything as root. Because if you get a virus, then the virus will have root privileges. So you normally want to sign in as a non-privileged user account, and then when you need to do something as root, either su or sudo. So I'm just going to force this. I wish I didn't have to do this. I don't know what the issue is, but okay. And so now I'm going to do it with the make. Again, I might have done this, been able to do this all in one line. I don't know for sure. Okay, now we are going to edit this file so it automatically renews our Kerberos tickets. We don't have to do it manually. I'm going to go to the very bottom, hit a lowercase o, that puts me in insert mode. Then I'm going to add these 3 lines. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go back to RHS1. I want to make sure I added all 3 lines there as well. I forgot to add this line inside of this file, so I'm going to do it now. Sudo vi etc. So you're going to go back into RHS1 and add the line that I'm adding. If you followed my documentation on the web page, it's there. I just skipped it. Let me do that again so you know what keys I'm pressing. Okay, so I'm going to sudo vi and edit this file. I'm going to go down to the KRB5 lifetime equal 1 hour. Then I'm going to hit a lowercase o. Then I'm going to start typing my command that I missed. I should have added that line from the beginning. And so while that's going on, I'm going to reboot this machine and then go to the other, back to the other. Sorry. When I did this command, when I did this on the other machine, I'd skipped this and I shouldn't have. So I'm going to press escape to get out, :WQ. I'm going to restart Sssd. Then I'm going to allow everyone from the domain to sign into this box. Then I'm going to test to see if I can get a ticket. I can list the ticket if I wanted. So I can successfully sign in as the domain. So I'm going to reboot this box. So I'm going to go back to RHS1, sign in as Devops. So there's a utility called SSH. It allows me to remotely connect to other Linux boxes um, using a terminal. And everything you do between those two boxes is encrypted. But by default, what it's going to do is ask me for the password every single time. So what I want to do is configure SSH using authentication, using SSH keys. I want to authenticate using SSH keys as opposed to a password. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you what SSH does. So I want to sign in as Devops to rhs2.contoso.com. It's going to first prompt me to save the server key, which I'm going to do. Then it's going to prompt me for my password. So now I am connected to RHS2. So I'm going to exit, so I disconnect. I'm going to show you something else, guys, while I'm here. If I do a host rhs2.contoso.com, I can see I resolved that to an IP. If I look at my local host file, that's not in my local host file. So I'm going to go to my DC. I'm going to sign in. So Linux understands dynamic DNS, and so does um, Windows. So basically, if you're part of the domain, it will automatically add the appropriate DNS records for any machine that's joined to the domain. So in this case, for both of my Linux boxes, it added an A record and a pointer record. So I don't need to configure local name resolution for between the two boxes because we're going to let DNS handle that for us. So again, if I use SSH to connect to the other box, it's going to prompt me for the password. It didn't prompt me for the server key because I already copied it. So the first time you connect, you have to copy the server key. SSH keys are created in pairs, a public and private key pair. When you sign a packet with the public key, only the private key can decrypt it, and vice versa. If you sign a packet with the public key, only the private key can decrypt it. So we download the server's public key. So every time we're going to send a packet to the server, we're going to encrypt it with the public key, then only the private key can decrypt it. So my goal is now not to have to type the password every single time. So what I'm going to do is create some DevOps key. I'm signed in as Devops. So I'm going to create a public and private key for my DevOps user. Just like the server has a public and private key, I want my user to have one as well. So I'm going to do SSH keygen. I'm not making any changes. I'm just pressing enter. So I created a public and private key. List my home directory, the SSH directory. That means my home directory, and there's a hidden folder called SSH. So I want to list all the files in it. There's my public and private key. There's the server key that I copied. It's inside of there. So I'm going to look at that file. There's the server's public key that I downloaded when I first connected. So what I'm going to do right now is use a command to take my public key for my user account DevOps and copy it over to the DevOps user on SSH2, RHS2. So I'm going to do SSH copy ID to the user account DevOps at I'm going to sign in. Okay, so now copy the key over. So now when I do SSH, over to the other box, it doesn't prompt me for my password. So when we're doing Ansible, it's going to use SSH to run Python scripts on the other boxes, because that's what Ansible is going to do. If you watched any of the other videos that I put on LinkedIn, or you've read the book a little bit, you'll know that Ansible is going to allow me to control other boxes. Um, and it's going to do that by creating Python scripts and run those Python scripts remotely. So now it's going to be able to connect to that other machine without prompting me for the password, just to make my life a little easier. Guys, and since I don't have a lot of Linux boxes, I might want to pretend my Ansible control host is also a managed host. So I'm going to copy the key back to myself. So if I list my SSH directory, now I'm going to copy my key to myself. And it's just a little trick I do. It's actually kind of stupid, but what it did was it took my public key and copied it into this file, created a new file called authorized keys. It did the same thing on RHS2. I didn't show you, but so when I try to SSH to myself now, which I don't know why you would want to do this, but so I can pretend I have more hosts that are remote when they're actually the same host. When I SSH to myself, it won't prompt me for a password. Guys, if you're SSHing to the same user account on the other box, you don't need to put the user account. It'll be the same thing. So now I'm not prompted for the password. So during the labs, I can pretend RHS1 is another remote host that I can SSH to and run commands remotely, when in fact I'm running it locally. So guys, this other thing is optional, but I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to install Visual Studio's code on this box so we can use Visual Studio's code to create scripts as opposed to VI. I don't know if everyone's very comfortable with VI, so I'm going to give you a graphics text editor to create these scripts that we're going to be creating, YAML scripts. So I'm going to do RPM, and I'm going to import Microsoft creates Visual Studio's code. So when you download off a repository, you want to trust that repository. So every time I use a trusted repository and they create a software package on that repository, they sign it with their keys. So when I download it, I'm going to decrypt it with their keys. And if I can decrypt it, I know no one's altered that package. I know it came from that vendor or that repository. You only want to install software, especially in a production system, from trusted sources. And I trust Microsoft. So I'm just importing their keys. And maybe not. Okay, I'm just going to do this graphically. So I'm going to go down to code visualstudios.com, and I can do a snap, which is like a package. I was trying to do this, it didn't work. We'll just try to copy it. Oh, maybe not. I'm going to sign in as root, paste that in there. That worked. I'm going to grab all this, and paste it in my terminal. Now I just need to do this. Guys, I don't care if you use Yum or DNF, it's the same software in our box. So we're going to do Yum check update, because we now have a new repository. And Yum install code. Click yes. So now we have this nice utility to write scripts. We don't have to use VI. So we'll play around with this when we need it. But this is just some sort of graphic code editor. So I'm just type exit out of there, exit out of there. This is what I searched for to get to that page. Visual Studios Code, Red Hat. I went to the Visual Studios site, not to one of these other sites. And when you get there, I'm going to scroll down to the part that says Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Fedora, or CentOS. I SU'd as root. If you just copy this without SUing, this will work fine as well. Okay, so guys, this is the first part of this lab. Basically, what we did is we copied our lab, we got all our machines configured, all part of the domain, and we have Ansible installed. Nothing's configured as far as Ansible. We also opened up um, WinRM on both the DC and the MS server, so our Ansible control hosts can connect to those machines and run commands remotely. We also have Python 36 installed, Python 3.6 installed on RHS2, so we can run Python scripts remotely, and we're going to use SSH to connect. And on RHS1, we actually installed Ansible as well. We haven't configured it, we just installed it. So that's going to be it for this video. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.